With Steam sales, new releases, ports, emulation, anniversary editions, fan games, and Splatoon, it can be very difficult to manage the total nebulous amount of games you want to play. At the end of 2023 going into 2024, inspired by this video, I made my own gaming backlog. The purpose was to put to paper the exact number of games that I have actively wanted to play or replay. When I finish a game, I undergo this sort of paralysis that I find really uncomfortable. I wind up feeling like there's too much to play and simultaneously nothing to play. Finding a new game to play that's not somewhere on my to-do list gives me this burst of dopamine for the first few hours. The first few hours of a game are built like that. There's intentionally a lot of stimulus and positive reinforcement and trophies and gameplay sections which are completely dissimilar to the rest of the game. But it costs money or some effort to download it, and there's always some lingering guilt that by adding this new game, the list grows longer. What I really wanted was to get a quantitative system that promoted shortening that list as much as possible before or instead of adding new games. And so the first version of the backlog was born. The 2023 prototype listed all of the games I could think of that I wanted to play or replay, and I had some information about them in helping me to make a choice. The intent was that if I scanned through the list, I'd be able to visualize the exact number of games and not have to draw from a database in my biased and frequently incorrect brain. I came up with 56 games total, which I was able to knock 26 games off of to 30 total by using a few categorization techniques. The first one is whether or not I own the game already. Having to buy the game should be slightly prohibitive. Secondly, is there DLC or post-game for it? Thirdly, how badly do I want to play it on a scale of 1 to 10? And lastly, but most difficultly, how many hours will the game take? Shorter games should take precedent if I'm trying to knock games off, after all. The question is tricky though, because many of the games I've already played for some number of hours and it's kind of hard to take a good guess. This was my first calculation the backlog ran. To get a goalpost for how long the game may take, I'd gone onto howlongtobeat.com and recorded the time it takes average players to beat just the main story. From there, I would have to get some means of predicting how long it takes me personally on average to finish a game compared to this number. So for each game, I had data I would record for a corrective factor that records how much quicker or slower I beat the game compared to the how long to beat time. A corrective factor of 0.5 means I beat a game twice as fast, and a corrective factor of 2 means I was twice as slow, and 1 means I finished it at exactly the estimated time. The average of each of these scores would determine a corrective factor which could be used to make a best guess for how long any given game would take me to beat. The difference of that predicted time and how long I had already been playing should tell me how long each game had left in order to be beaten. 2024 would be the first full year that I would spend using the backlog as a tool. I had crossed off as many easy short games as I could in 2023, and the rubber was kind of hitting the road for whether or not this process would work at chopping the list down meaningfully. I entered the year with 30 games, and left with 31, unfortunately. But hear me out, because the process was really good. The first thing I added was this list of overall statistics. I wanted to track how many games I entered with, how many I left with, how many games I beat, added, and removed. And this is the main push and pull. I decided early on that I wouldn't disallow myself from adding games, and many of my favorite games of the year were certainly not on the list January 1st. If I didn't add them, they would just float to the back of my brain and I would just cheat and decide to add them a year later or once I beat one of the other games, and that completely defeats the purpose of the backlog. I also removed some games, as I'll talk about later in the year. I also wanted to track the average scores from the games I beat and how many hours daily I was playing. I used that daily average compared to the complete number of hours predicted to finish all games in order to get an estimate for how many years it would take to clear the backlog if nothing else was added. We consistently hovered around 1,000 something hours and 2 hours a day for a projected end date of 2 years away. The backlog was doing its job though. I finished a ton of games in the spring and was making good progress. I slowly added more games, but the short snacks were getting knocked off quickly. As the list got a bit more difficult though, the easy 10-hour games were mostly gone and a good number of new games were introduced. I began to get overwhelmed and paralyzed. I wanted some system that could tell me clearly which games were the best candidates to play next. And so in the summer, I created a ranking system for the games. I wanted to be able to give each game a numerical score corresponding to how badly I should play it. And I know what you're thinking, there's already a place to input that and it doesn't require any calculations. The desire to play column I update somewhat regularly as my interest in games shifts, and that should be where the ranking of games I should play next comes from. And certainly I plan to use that column to inform the ranking of games, but I considered two additional factors which would be weighted equally with desire to play. The Metacritic score, while not always lining up with my own personal taste and not inherently true, is an excellent indicator of how good I should expect a game to be. And lastly, the total time it takes to beat a game, measured with the earlier calculation, should make a game more attractive to pick up. In other words, a short, high-quality game that I want to play is ideal. Since a lot of these scores have their own unique ranges and spreads, I decided to give a game a perfect score of 10 out of 10 for a respective category if it was the best game out of all the options, and a 0 out of 10 if it was the worst. So The Wolf Among Us gets a 10, Persona 3 gets a 0 for time, Demon's Souls gets a 5.1 for time. Even though critics gave Tears of the Kingdom a 9.6 out of 10, it was the highest score on the list, so it gets a 10. Similarly, even though Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness only got a 6.4 from critics, it was by far the lowest reviewed game, so it gets a 0. Using these three scores out of 10, which are themselves average to a single score out of 10, a list was formed that ranked the games quantitatively. The cool thing about the list too is as I'd update the hours played every day, I'd get closer to finishing some games and the time score would increase and they would climb the list. This list really helped me to look at some old games I was holding on to because I felt like I should play them. And when I saw that they were scored poorly for time, interest, and critical reception, I had to ask myself why they were on the list in the first place. I removed 4 games total. I was less diligent with the games added, however, adding a stunning 29 games, some brand new and some that I had just forgotten to add earlier, while beating 22 games total in the year. Moving into 2025, I have 31 games total, and I plan to add a few functions to the backlog so I can track my year based on when I beat certain games, how many hours I played daily graphed as a function of time, and other time-sensitive changes the backlog had previously been insensitive to. The moral of the story, which will come as a tremendous shock to all, is play what you're into and add or remove games as you see fit. Some of the quantitative tools the backlog offers were incredible for me in narrowing down what to play, and to avoid that feeling of dread or panic when I finish a game that I liked a lot and I don't know how to move forward. I have this persistent, burning desire to avoid new places and new social events, but when you step out of your comfort zone and go to some of those things, even when they're a little bit unpleasant, it's normally worth it and makes you glad to have gone. I found that the same thing is true for a lot of these games, which I've held onto for years or even a decade, waiting to play or waiting to develop interest in it. Any tool like this backlog, which motivates someone to consume more art or experience a story they genuinely like that there was some resistance to breaking into, I think that's useful and cool. Thank you to Daryl Talks Games for the idea for this backlog, which has consumed my year, and thank you for watching. If there's any good progress on the backlog, I may make an update once 2025 is finished. My favorite games I played this year were Persona 4 Golden, which got me back into games and took over my life for a few months, Disco Elysium, which is so smart and rich and cool, Amori, which made me sob uncontrollably and is a masterpiece I want to make a video about, Metal Gear Rising, which made me fall back in love with Metal Gear, Danganronpa V3, which had the best story of any Danganronpa game to me and which I want to make a video about, and Ghost Trick, which I think had all my favorite parts of Ace Attorney with no fat at all, and which I want a sequel to desperately. Thank you again for watching. Let me know what your plan for your gaming backlog is and what your favorite games of the year were.